I'm Dr. Suzanne Zeedyk, Director of the organization Connected Baby. In 2009, I had the pleasure of interviewing Karyn McCluskey and John Carnochan, co-founders and co-directors of the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit. At that point, their work in establishing the VRU had been underway for about 5 years, having been first established in 2004 in what was then Strathclyde Police. We met to talk about what they meant by a public health approach to tackling violence, what on earth babies and young children had to do with reducing violence, and the courage that it takes to lead change in the way we think in professional systems and the wider public. But the project we were working on got delayed, and we had to set aside the film footage, and eventually it was forgotten. Earlier this year, in 2019, our team at Connected Baby rediscovered that footage, a full decade after it had first been recorded. And we thought that the public deserved to share in this discovery and to reflect on the insights that John and Karyn were already offering, even at that early stage in the journey of the VRU. We thought this especially given the leading role that the VRU went on to play in changing the way that we think about violence, understand the long-term impact of childhood trauma and adverse childhood experiences, and in devising responses to societal challenges. The impact of the VRU has been felt not only throughout Scotland, but well beyond our borders internationally. And so, 10 years after they first recorded this conversation, we are delighted with their agreement to bring you this unique interview with John Carnochan and Karyn McCluskey. You're head of the Violence Reduction Unit and a policeman. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us what the history of that is and how that came about?
Okay. But 2004 in Strathclyde, I'm a Strathclyde officer. We were tasked, myself and Karyn were tasked, Karyn McCluskey, to develop a homicide reduction strategy, which was the sort of thing that most forces were doing at that time. It was one of these things that goes and everybody should be doing one. If you don't have one, you're not really doing the job right. And so we started to look at that idea of a homicide reduction strategy, and found that to do that would suggest that every homicide is intentional. And so the first thing we realised was that it's not. The vast majority of homicides are largely happenstance. There may be a violent act, but the outcome is largely happenstance. And so that was the first thing. We then agreed that we had to look at violence in the round and not just particular types of themed violence. So we have the Violence Reduction Unit. We don't look at violent crime, we look at violence, from suicide to bullying, because it's all connected. We just happen to make some of it criminal, and it's only made known to us. So we only know, for instance, that about 30% of those who turn up at A&Es as a result of violent acts are reported to the police. Women who are the victims of domestic abuse or domestic violence will suffer a whole series of assaults before they actually report it to the police. So it seemed to us absurd that we only became interested in it when they reported it. We should be interested in it long before that point of impact. So that started us thinking about it. You know, Karyn did lots of work around the WHO, the World Health Organization report 2002, where they suggested that interpersonal violence was a public health issue. And when we started to look at it in that way and frame the problem from a public health perspective, things started to make sense. There was a new lexicon. There was a way of looking at things for generational change, and not that do something this week and measure it next week idea, but actually seeing things that made real sustainable changes. Because the criminal justice system was meant to be the system of last resort, or the service of last resort. Everything else should be broken before criminal justice become involved. It was agreed we should all live our lives in reasonable and not commit crime and be good to one another, but that didn't happen. And so we have criminal justice, we have prisons, we have courts, we have laws, we have legislation. But what's happened over the years is criminal justice has very much become the service of first resort, because we're good at dealing with crisis, we're good at problem solving. So if you think you have more cops in the street, the world will be a better place, a whole range of things. So that's where we came from. And we were lucky enough that the Chief Constable at that time, Sir Willie Ray, had said, just do it then, because we said, it's not just a criminal justice problem. We need to share the agenda out. We need to understand how it's connected. We need to make sure that we understand the impact that our policing has on other services, the impact that health, social services, education, families, communities, how we all impact on each other. So that's how we started off. We did that for about a year, then we were given a national responsibility to do it, and we've been doing it now in Scotland for, since 2005, April 2006.
And tell us more about what that has to do with babies, because it's quite striking for many people that the police are interested in babies.
Okay. Well, one of the things that we looked at first of all was that we started in trying to frame the case and trying to frame the problem. We tried to develop arguments that would engage partners. So we developed an economic argument, understood it from an so if that's what motivated you to do something, then we had the case for it. If it was a moral argument, then let's do that. So we found some research that had been done by Scottish Enterprise for the Future Skills programme. And what they had done is they had, in trying to understand what was required for the future workforce in Scotland, they'd written to every employer in Scotland and asked them to highlight those things that were lacking in their employees. So they had a response of, I think, 180,000 questionnaires. And what they found was numeracy and literacy were actually quite low down. There was less than 20%. But the things that were in the top half, that were 50% and over, particularly in relation to young people in low-skill jobs, were the ability to problem solve, to communicate, and to work with others, and teamwork. And when we delved into that further, lo and behold, those are those non-cognitive skills. That set of skills that allow you to make good decisions about yourself, to negotiate life, to compromise, to negotiate, to communicate better with others. And that took us into the early years, because when we tried to find out about those skills and said, well, okay, if that's the skills that are lacking, how do we give people more skills? And we found work by James Heckman, who's a Nobel laureate. He's from Chicago. He's an economist. And he estimated that for every pound you spend in early years, you need to spend £11 later on in life to get the same result. So that started us thinking about those early years things and the connection between those life skills that were there and the behaviour of young men, particularly in interpersonal violence, that ability to solve conflict without actually resorting to violence, that ability to deal with your fellow human beings without being aggressive. And so that took us into that area of early years.
And you really believe that you can address the violence of young men through paying attention to what happened in their early years?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's loads of research around for that as well. And there's lots of things. I'll give you some anecdotes first as a police officer. Yeah. If you go to Pullman Prison and you take 12 young men, and there are 700 young men who are there, 70% are there for serious non-sexual violence. Take any 12 and ask them if they were the victim of or witnessed domestic abuse when they were children. And 12 out of 12 will say they did. Ask them if they had a positive role model in their life, and 10 out of 12 will say they didn't. So there's something around that. And then if you think about domestic abuse, if a mum's responsibility is to create a safe environment for a baby, and she's living with an aggressive partner who's abusive towards her and who's violent towards her, she can't even create a safe environment for herself. So when the baby's born into that sort of environment, the saying is, if you bring a child into a war zone, you'll create a warrior. So these young men are born into that household where they recognise and deal, and you know much better than me, babies are very complex and adapt very quickly and very well to the environment they're in. So if they adapt to that environment and start to get hardwired to that way of dealing with problems, that way of you respond by aggression, you respond by violence, you don't empathise with other people, you don't see that at all because it's not something you've experienced, then all of a sudden they're hardwired for that. They turn up at school and they're very difficult to engage at school. They become disengaged by the time they're 6 or 7. By the time they get to secondary school, they're a real problem. Teachers can say, that's the problem that's going to be for you in first year, tell other teachers. And all of a sudden, these young people are sidelined. They're gone. And if we don't actually start to do something about that secondary prevention at that stage, then we're going to, with a whole generation, are going to end up back in prison. So we think that if you get back to that very start, that primary prevention, that supporting parents to be as good as they can be, then what will happen is, in the generations that come, those babies who become fathers and mothers will be better. And then their children will be better, and their children, so we'll have a much better way about living with each other. There'll not be as much violence, there's not be as much interpersonal violence or domestic abuse. And I think too, if you, those skills that babies learn, that take into adulthood, that we think are innate, that allow them to make good decisions about themselves. That's good decisions about their health, about the alcohol they take, about the drugs they're offered and might not take, about violence, about teenage pregnancy. And I think that it's not naive or stretching the point to say, if you do that, there will be a benefit in all of those areas as well. There's no mistake about that. Because when you separate things out to see what the differences are, invariably that'll be the difference. The difference will be those early years.
And what kind of response did you get when it was suggested that the police was going to be working on these kinds of issues?
It was strange, first of all. Once we clarified that we didn't want to be in delivery rooms and actually being there at the time, I think that was clear. And all we were saying was, look, we can do what we can do. You need to understand what we're about. The police have a responsibility to contain and manage the problem that exists, because this is a problem that's complex and it's moving, and we need to fix it while it's moving. So there's not a single solution. There's not a single agency that will fix it. Collectively, we have to do it. And so all we were saying is, look, we can actually work and fill up the prisons. We're very good at that. I mean, the detection rate for murders in Strathclyde is 98% over 30 years. That's not a problem. We can do that. But other people need to be thinking about, well, how can we as a society slow that flow down to these, from the murders, the attempt murders, the serious assaults, the domestic abuse, the aggression. We need to, the suicides. We need to understand that all we are doing is I think that one of the analogies, there's several analogies around that make sense. I mean, in terms of health, our job's to stabilise the patient while others actually do fix the patient. We just stabilise it. That's all criminal justice will do. Keep a lid on it. Or if we think about, people keep falling off a cliff. Police worry about where we put the ambulance at the bottom. We should actually be putting a fence at the top. And we should be putting a big sign up that says don't go. Now that presumes that people can read the sign. That presumes that people can make good decisions about themselves. And that's what the early years are about. That's where it has to be. And convinced of that. So there are some. We have them in 3 groups. We have those who see the light, those who are startled by the light, and those who are still in the dark. But what we have to do is just keep, I think, saying it out loud and identifying that shared agenda and understanding I don't want to be in a delivery room. No way in the world. I'm not qualified to support parents, but I am qualified to say, listen, I've investigated enough murders, I've stood at enough gravesides, I've been at the Royal Infirmary in Glasgow and seen enough young men with their faces ripped open, I've been at enough domestic abuse, I've seen enough child abuse to say, this is not working, we need to do something else. And it's not for me to do it, but it's for others to do it. I'll certainly help. I'll say it out loud. I think the police can help in that. If it's about budget shift over the years to come, let's aspire. Let's be brave. And if you stop somebody in the street right now, anybody, and said, you stop the first grey-haired lady you see and ask her what she thinks the problem is. And she will say something like, it's the parents, son. It's in the home that matters. And that's not to say we're blaming the parents, because it's not like that. But the truth of the matter is, everybody knows there's a real importance around the family that we've forgotten. A real importance. When we were trying to make sense of it at first, if you have 6 children born on the same day in the same ward in the same hospital, and then they go home and they live in the same close, So there's 6 houses or flats in that close, in the same street, in the same town. And the wee boy who's born bottom left becomes a murderer and a drug addict. The wee boy who's born on the right becomes a social worker. The wee girl who's up here gets pregnant when she's 14 and becomes a prostitute and a heroin addict by the time she's 19. The woman across here becomes a nurse. The woman up here marries a guy who lives across from her and they live quite happily down the street. So what's the difference? The difference is behind the front doors. And you can't police that. It's not for the police to be in behind the front doors, but that's where the difference is. And it seems to me obvious that's where the difference is. So we need to understand what are the skills, what's needed, how do we support, how best do we support, what are the risks. So if you're a well-educated couple, late 20s, you live in a lovely area, you've got good jobs, good income, nice cars, nice family, you're going to have a baby, it will still be difficult bringing your baby up to be the best you can be. If you take those things away and say, well, okay, you don't live in a nice area, you're not late 20s, you're not well-educated, you don't have a wide supportive family or a wide social network, you're on your own, you're 16, and what you get when you have your baby is a flat on your own in one of the most deprived areas in Scotland, and you're asked to look after your baby then. Now bring your baby up. And it's a real challenge. So we know who needs the help. We know who needs support. We need to do it. Absolutely need to do it.
We don't need more police officers on the beat. We need more health visitors. Can you just tell us?
Well, it's about that argument about, yellow jackets in the street might make us feel quite a little safer, and that's fine. I mean, there is a thing about confidence and well-being and what's happening there. That's absolutely fine. But the truth of the matter is, to make a difference, I had said rather than 1,000 police, you'd be better with 1,000 health visitors, because health visitors are the ones who cross over that front door. They're the ones who can offer up the triage notion that says, right, this young mum's at risk, this young mum's got a black eye, this young mum has an alcohol problem, this young mum's living with an aggressive... That can identify and signpost services. That means we need to work much better together. We need to understand what our shared agenda is, who the shared client is, and the responsibility we have to do that, and not say, well, that's not my job, that's somebody else's job. And if we look over some of the dramatic and sad cases where services have gone wrong, invariably it's about not understanding that. It's about not understanding who the client is there and who actually needs our help, and delivering that help and delivering it with other partners. I mean, if you were starting with a blank sheet of paper today to design services to suit 21st century Scotland or 21st century UK, it wouldn't be the way it's set up.
How would it be?
Well, I think we would have been much more around that idea of pedagogues, much more around the idea of...
Mean?
Well, a pedagogue, I think, is someone who doesn't come along and say, look, I'm a criminal justice social worker, I'm a family social worker, I'm a police officer, but someone who comes along and said, I'm a problem solver, I'm here to help you. Whatever your problems are, I'll help you. I'll signpost you. So if you need help reading and writing, I'll do that. If you need help bathing your baby, I'll do that. If you need help to stop smoking, stop drinking, I'll help you to do that. Or I'll get someone who will. Someone who will actually be the Sherpa that will help somebody, will be the guide. Because some parents right now don't have the social skills, don't have the skills that will take them from where they live into the city centre. They don't have those sort of skills. And they're bringing up their babies. We've got children bringing up children who are brought up by children. It's not that parents are saying, I'm going to be a bad parent. It's they don't have the skills to pass on. They're not doing it deliberately. Do you think nobody would do that? So we need to try and help. That's where we break that cycle. We need to deal with the outcomes of that right now. I mean, the next generation of murderers are in class today. They're at school now. And their victims will be in the same class or the class above them. So we need to do something for them as well. But we also need to do something for the future. And so that's about parenting skills in the hospital, parenting skills in the prison for these young guys. Tell them how to be dads. Because they don't know. Because they've never had a dad. And that's an important part of their life. That's a teachable moment when they have a child and say, I don't want the same for my son as there is for me. Well, let's grab that moment and make sure it's not. And that's about helping them too. So it's about doing all of these things. And police can't do it. But we need to get better at encouraging others to do it.
And do you think that people are hearing that message?
I do. I mean, I do think it's going to take time. And I'm not particularly patient. But I think it's important that we keep saying out loud, and there is a growing sense that this is becoming almost a movement that's saying, look, you know, there's more and more people coming to the crossroads and saying, I mean, you know, you're asking as a police officer, well, I've arrived here, you know, at this crossroads thinking, well, as a cop, it's not working for me. You speak to A&E consultants, they'll tell you the same thing. Speak to teachers, they'll tell you the same thing. You know, speak to social workers who are caseloads that are this high and dealing with a really difficult end. Then we need to fix it. But we need to take a breath and say, well, we need to contain and manage it right now, but we need to also think about the next generations. That's not to say we've given up on anybody, we don't. But there are some young men right now who are out there who are so violent that the best we can hope for is they don't harm anybody. That if they get to jail, they're in the jail and they don't make it any worse, or they stay at home and don't harm anybody. That's the best we can hope for. But we need to think about the primary, the generational change, the group that's already there and already at risk and doing something for them as well. So there's more and more people coming to it. In Scotland, we've got a early years minister, an early years framework. It could have been better. Of course it could have been better, but at least it's there. It's something to discuss. It's something to start and shift and affect. And I think there's also a consensus and an understanding that it's no longer about let's have more cops in the street tonight and fix it over the next 3 weeks. We can't problem solve it. It's not going to go away. Violence will not go away. That's why we're the violence reduction unit. We're not the violence eradication unit, because you're never going to get rid of it. And we're not naive enough to think that. But we absolutely need to make a start on it. And I think we've done that. And I am hopeful that we've started. There's a quote I've been using lately from Václav Havel, who said that hope is not the certainty in a particular outcome, but the belief in what you're doing is right. And I think this is right. It just feels right. You know the science behind it. I don't know the science, but it just feels right.
Tell us more about the disease prevention model that the Violence Reduction Unit has adopted.
Originally, we've always looked at violent crime, and we've treated it from a criminal justice perspective, which meant that a crime was committed, we then investigated it, we then usually arrested a suspect, they were dealt with and went to prison, and that was it. And when we started to look at that over the past 30 years, and particularly when we first started our research, we realised it hadn't actually led to any reductions in violent crime. It hadn't prevented anything, because we were absolutely fantastic at detecting stuff, but it hadn't led to any prevention. And we technically are all about preventing crime. So we felt that we needed a radical look at what we were doing and come up with something a bit different. And we started to look at different models, and we then looked at public health and disease. So, for example, if we were looking at if measles was treated the way as violent crime was, what we'd say is we'd wait until you got measles, we'd put you in a sanatorium, you'd either die or your measles would go away, and then we'd let you back out. Now, measles wouldn't be cured, but it'd make everybody else feel safe. And that's what we've been doing for hundreds of years in criminal justice. But that's not what they did. What they did was they first found out who was the at-risk groups, how much of the actual disease was there, so surveillance. They then looked at, obviously, who was at risk, and it was babies. Babies were at risk. They then designed prevention, that was the injection, and then they scaled it up nationally. And the result is we have herd immunity. We don't have measles happening quite so much now, you know, in fact it's almost eradicated. So we applied that to violent crime, violence, and violence as a disease. So, you know, surveillance, how much violence do we have? And actually what we know is we only know about 30% of the violence that occurs, because violence is normal. So we had to find out how much violence was there. We then looked at the risk and protective factors. So who was at risk? Young men. You know, and alcohol and a whole range of other things were the risk factors that allowed that to occur. Poor parenting, or parenting that wasn't supported. And then we looked at the protective factors. What could make a difference? And then we looked at, you know, some of the things that actually work. So parenting, support, putting people into, talk to the at-risk groups, so things like campus officers into schools, replacing some of the male role models that are so missing in our society. And then tertiary prevention, you know, that the ones that are already infected by it. So doing interventions within the clinic so that people feel supported, they don't feel that they're victimised through the crime, or that we can help them address their violent behaviour. And then we try and scale it up nationally. So we treat it as a disease. You know, you catch it from your mum and dad. You then go out into the, your community, and you meet other people who are also infected, and you pass it on. So, and that pretty much is our model.
So you really think you can inoculate against violence?
Well, you can't. The problem is we will never find a single vaccine that will inoculate against violence, and sadly it's not that simple. In a way, it would be nice if it was an actual disease and we could find there is a scientific intervention we could put in. Sadly, the inoculation comes in 100 forms. So that will be about primary prevention, that will be about supporting parents and young kids, and secondary prevention, tackling those who are at risk, and that predominantly is young men. And then tertiary prevention, tackling those who are already infected by violence. So that's intervening in prisons, intervening in clinics and hospitals where people have been victimised. So we can apply the same philosophy. It's just that the interventions are slightly more numerous.
And one of the ways in which you're seeking to get out this message is through what you call David's story. Mm-hmm. Can you just tell us a little bit about that story and about how you came to use it?
Well, we often talk about policy and strategy, and it turns people off. And what we really needed to say was how policy hit the pavement. Because what policy needs to do is make a difference to the people on the ground, because that's what we're all about in public service, is making a difference to people. So what I did was we had a piece of CCTV which was about a young murderer called David, who was 15 and a half. And I show people it frequently and they're horrified by it and they think he needs to go to jail.
Describe it to us.
Well, he's a young man who's gang fighting in the city centre of Glasgow, and he stabs a man as he's caught in the heat of battle, and the man dies at the locus. He dies at the scene of the crime, and it's absolutely tragic. He was a innocent bystander, and sheer happenstance, because I don't think David left the house that night to kill somebody, but that's exactly what he did. And it is a horrific piece of CCTV, and people always want to jail the young boy who did it, and quite rightly. What he did was a horrendous thing which damaged hundreds of lives, from his family to the victim's family, to a whole range of people. But what I did was, I decided to have a look at David. And I went right back to when before David was actually born, to his mum and his family and his upbringing. And what I did was a sequence of events, a timeline. Now I would normally do that for a murder. I would look at what happened in the murder and find out who was at the scene and everything else like that. And I applied that intelligence philosophy to David's life. And what unfolded was a tragic sequence of events, from David being born to a parent who had a problem with alcohol on his own, who lived a life which was blighted by domestic violence, where him and his mother as a victim were moved from a house in a poor area to a house in an even poorer area to a house in an even poorer area, because as a victim they were moved to a whole sequence of dreadful locations. Not the offender, but the victims. He moved house almost 11 times before the age of 9. We then, because his mum couldn't cope, put him with his grandmother and her family, thinking that was a good thing to do, but the family were completely dysfunctional. And in the house where David was at the age of 8, there was 4 uncles who had 120 convictions between them for a whole series of violence and armed robbery and drug dealing, who, when you looked at them, were probably quite a defensive family of David, because if you'd crossed David, they would have exacted retribution, but a very toxic environment for a young boy of 8 who'd already seen violence his whole life. And then by the time he gets to school, secondary school, he then starts to offend. He gets involved in gang violence. He's truanting. His family are resistant to involvement, and we thought that was unusual. And actually, the amount of time we could have intervened beforehand was numerous, but we only ever got interested when he started to offend and caused problems to other people. And the first time that he offended, a 22-year-old social worker was addressed to his case. Now, she was too young, such a complex family, and a whole range of problems within that family, and nothing really happened, to the point when David actually committed a murder at the age of 15 and a half. He goes to jail. His mum dies of a heroin overdose. He comes out of jail at the age of 22, and he basically continues as he was before, because David's already damaged. You know, the damage has already been wrought in his life, and he won't change. He lacks empathy. He lacks communication skills. He lacks a whole range of the social skills that will make him a good human being. And he goes back into an environment where the majority of the street has criminal histories. So the tipping point in that street in terms of the sort of social function is towards that criminal element. So David fits right in. And perhaps the most tragic point now is the fact that David has a baby son who was born last year, who's living in the same street that David was brought up in. And my question to policymakers and a whole range of other people is David's son's life going to be any better than David's? And I am always a glass half full person, but I think that David's son's life is not going to be any better than David's unless we absolutely do something now and support David's parents and, you know, and David's wider family to bring up a baby in a different way.
And what do the policymakers say when you tell them that story?
Well, from an intelligence perspective, I thought that this is just what I do. I didn't think it was particularly spectacular because there are thousands of Davids out there who might not commit murder but are alcoholics and drug addicts and dysfunctional and depressed, and the list goes on. So the murder is a unique event, but it could have been anything. His life was destined to be quite disastrous. And it shows a human face. And it has been an absolute dramatic story because what the policymakers now see is how their policy affects the person on the street. And so when they're now coming up with, you know, new strategies, the question that they ask themselves is, what difference would this have made to David's life? And I think that's the question.
And does that surprise you that has been such an effective way to get them to see the policies? Or not?
It has surprised me, but we have always kept, in the Violence Reduction Unit, we've always thought about the person at the end of what we do. And it has always been about making people's lives better and about delivering public service. But sometimes the further you are away from that, and perhaps at government, it's hard to see the people at the end of it because you've got a big job. You're having to deliver, you know, services to the whole population, 5 million people in Scotland. So perhaps you just need reminded occasionally, and for people at the sharp end to just demonstrate how the people at government are connected to what happens on the street. The reason that we need to do so many different things is the demographic has changed. We don't live in 1930s or 1940s where the nuclear family is in place. We have services which are designed for the nuclear family, and 60% of our households now in Glasgow and perhaps is going through Scotland are single occupancy, are single parent families. So the nature of the family has changed. Single parents are the norm, and we have to design services that support that because we can't force people to go back into a 2.5 children and and a mum and a husband and somebody goes out to work. We don't have that anymore. So we have to support the way that families are going. And I think that's really important, and single parents and families need a great deal of support nowadays. We talk about how difficult it is to bring up kids. It's the hardest thing in the world. I'm a single parent. I'm very well educated, I have a good job, I have a very supportive family. I cannot imagine, and I still find it incredibly difficult, if I was on my own in a council property with a whole range of very negative influences around me. I don't know how I'd bring up a child. And I admire some of the women that I meet and the families that I meet that bring up kids who are really well-rounded and supported and everything else in the most difficult of environments. That's real resilience. I'm not resilient in comparison to them. They really are resilient, and we need to support them much more.
What is it that keeps you going in doing this? I guess I'm wondering what your personal motivation, because there's a lot of passion in what you're saying. So what is it that keeps you engaged and your glass half full?
I think we have to be eternal optimists. The Scots are generally, we are pessimistic. But we have to be optimistic, we have to be brave, we have to be aspirational, we have to think about where we want to go in Scotland. You know, the vision, about what do you want it to be like. I don't need to affect that many people. I mean, I look at some of the successes that we've had, and I know that we've made a difference to people's lives.
Like what?
Some of the work that we've done in some of the schools that we, about some of the young people say, the campus officers in the schools have made a huge difference to my life. You know, they've made me stay at school. They've valued me. They've listened to me. They've made me feel like a responsible human being. That's a great thing for somebody to say to you, you know. And if I stopped tomorrow, I'd feel endlessly proud of the work that they've delivered in the schools and feel proud that I had a hand in that. And we've got loads of stories like that. Now, we have to keep on going, and that's a resilience. You need real resilience. And when people say, oh, you're never going to be able to affect that, you know, we have to say, well, you have to get out of our way then, because we're absolutely determined to do it. You know, it's that whole philosophy. If you're not on our bus, then don't be in front of it, because we're going forward. And that's what you need. That's what you need in this business. And, you know, and it's not a business, it's a philosophy.